The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together.
Well, they didn't.
Very serious. The referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland.
The playing fields of class blame. All bewail the voiced mask of the new Puritan. The broken country awakes to the new blame. On the plasma screen of colonial pleasures, my shame is your delight. Platelets for the supply of war, fodder, fertilised by the decaying bodies of the Scottish working class. On poppy fields far from wildflowers, hackles are raised peacefully on the myopic red lens of the dreamer. Disarming facts permit new boundaries of sense. On the common wheel of memory, counting dead factories, soldiers, national debt, guilt mines of subsidised belonging, pages of the old naming flutter. On a strong breeze, I plant feet on words detached from playing fields, without the laughter of women, with furious tongues, lashings of new sentences for the entitlement of decency and voice, classed, of course. Full of accented vowels of protest, snapping a disobedience with cool, sharp mouth, spilling your rage back to you across the closed gate of the motherless places where you learn to order the killings.
Hello, welcome to the Scottish Independence Podcast, and we're back after a little break. The poem you just heard was by Lorna Waite. With Lorna, I had a kind of two-part conversation. The first part was about Lorna herself and some of the work she does, and I think you'll find that it's very, very interesting indeed. And secondly, as part of the series with supporters of different football teams, because I think it's going to be an interesting part of how the independence debate plays out, what's going on in the stadiums, Lorna came on to talk about Rangers and how the independence debate is going to work out with some Rangers fans. That part of it didn't turn out so positive, but have a listen and see what you think. We'll just go straight to the conversation. I'll see you at the other end. Hello Lorna, how are you doing?
Hello Mike, I'm very well, thank you.
Good. I suppose for a lot of people in the kind of Scottish cultural community and literary community, you're quite well known, but for other people that are listening, because I know that there's people listening all around the world actually, could you just explain a bit about yourself and your writing?
That poem comes from my book, The Steel Garden, poetry book, which is dedicated to the memory of my uncle, who was a steel worker. I come from the town of Kilburnley in Ayrshire, which had a steel industry and a textile industry, and very much like many of the wee towns in the West Coast, was absolutely utterly traumatised during the 80s with the deindustrialisation. And so a lot of my work and my PhD, of which my book was part of that, was very much trying to articulate a bit of that story, because I certainly think that has been not, if the story has been told, it certainly hasn't been listened to. And I'd say that those early experiences formed my lifelong commitment to Scottish independence. At the same time, I've never been a member of a party. So that's kind of where I come from. Also, my family has kind of Highland connections. So that's always been an aspect of my identity that's been really important to me. And also the inability of any Scottish child to actually pronounce any mountain on the map of Scotland. So that means we already have a linguistic deficit as well as a democratic deficit.
Sorry, where did you do your PhD?
I did my PhD at Duncan of Jordanson, practice-based. My supervisor was Gavin Rennick, who works now in Canada in traditional knowledge projects and with Indigenous First Nation peoples of Canada. So that idea of Indigenous knowledge and the idea of the elder and the importance of that in history, not just as history but as living memory, which is actually connected to an ecology of place, is really important, and that was partly influenced by Gavin's supervision. One of the reasons I went to Indy was because it had that possibility of interdisciplinarity, and also the fact that the Dene had more power than Scotland.
To come back with saying where you came, that's one of the reasons you supported Indy. So do you tend to come from it, because there was a mix of what you're saying, there's the kind of devastation of some of the industries, but also from a linguistic deficit. So you're talking from a cultural and an economic perspective there. Is there one or the other that's more important for you, or do you feel we should concentrate on one idea rather than the other? I mean, would you come from it from a more cultural perspective, wanting independence, or from a more economic perspective?
Well, I think this is where the role of women is really, really important, because I think that's a kind of false opposition, either or. And I'd actually say that it's like a piece of tartan, my approach to independence. I think that certainly from an analysis of the economic point of view, the case is absolutely, unquestionably, we need that power. But it's deeper than that. It's absolutely fundamentally deeper than that. And it's a kind of taking care of the land. It's having power to actually have self-respect, because I actually see the relationship at the moment between Westminster and Scotland is fundamentally abusive and violent, and actually embodying all the characteristics of that relationship. And I think that the consequences of that are both psychological, are economic, are linguistic, are literary. And so almost in a way that our vision for a new Scotland actually has to both address all of those silences, as well as address the kind of need for self-determination at an economic level, at a linguistic level, and at an educational level, because we still in a way are invisible to ourselves, strangely enough.
Strangers in our own country, in a way.
Well, we're not, but it's almost like embodying a kind of schizoid position. And if you internalise the unionist position, you end up actually mad.
It's the too small, too poor, too stupid argument.
Totally, and it's also kind of really, really projecting a kind of colonial aspect, which is at the same time deeply, it's dangerous. And we've seen that with the escalation of the nature of the language attendant upon their arguments, and the fractures and dissonances, and they can't resolve that other than through greater inferiorism of the independence movement. That's the logical conclusion to their psychological dynamic. Whereas in the independence movement, there's people who do not embody the old or hold, like young folk in their 20s, who don't have a sentimental attachment to the old Labour Party, who are going to be voting for the first time, who have a very different economic environment, even than the one that I did, who have more barriers to themselves as young working class folk than I did.
With the current crop, it doesn't look like it's going to improve anytime soon. But just to come back to the cultural element of it as well, what kind of changes do you think, what kind of changes would you like to see in an independent Scotland that would bring back the self-respect?
Certainly, well, I would have a ministry for peace and education, and I would have a department of women and disarmament, so that Scotland legally and internationally could actually have its women contributing to its foreign policy, which will of course have major repercussions in terms of how we're looked at culturally internationally. We exist in some sense more visibly internationally than we do within Scotland, you know, with the whole debacle around Creative Scotland, blah, blah, blah. So in terms of an independent Scotland, we have a rich literature which doesn't get represented properly internationally. In a way, it will give us the status of an independent nation so that we can actually get some visibility, whether that's a Gaelic film Shack never getting nominated for, put forward as an Oscar towards kind of Hollywood so that we marginalise the Gaelic culture, whether it's inferiorism of, I don't know, let's say Red Road, which wonderful film, which never got the same status as The Queen that year. So that's even at the celebrity culture level of like, let alone at the organic level, where so many exciting things are going on that are just never really given a proper articulation in any of the media, really.
On the linguistic level, you're mentioning Gaelic films there. Do you speak Gaelic?
Ha Gaelic achum, ha me Jonsach Gaelic. I'm learning Gaelic. I have a bit of Gaelic, and one of the books I'm actually one of the editors of is rethinking Highland art, the visual significance of Gaelic culture. That came out of a major research project at Dundee led by Professor Murdo MacDonald, whose contribution to Scottish art is immense, really. And that book will be coming out this year. It's called in Gaelic, Ishalach Asur Yali na Giltach, Brilir Shinan and Dulchis nan Gael. And that again will be looking often Scottish art, kind of like Scotland itself at the moment is considered as not existing. So it's looking again at our visual culture and actually just looking at it through new lenses and filters and actually realising, hey, did you know that William McTaggart, you know, that great painter, was a Gaelic speaker? Or looking at often the Gaeltacht is not considered as having a visual tradition, and yet if you look at its material culture and contemporary art practice, it's and also in terms of the contribution it can make to help us in the Central Belt understanding about land reform and the involvement of women in land reform. In recent times, say, I'm thinking of people like Issy McPhail of the University of the Highlands and Islands, all of the community buyout experience. There's real lessons we must learn from that, and I think independence will give us that opportunity, hopefully, you know, to try and reconcile these kind of slightly fragmented parts of Scotland so that we get to know each other. And also, Gaelic looks at the world so differently, and I found that a surprise when I started learning Gaelic. And for instance, you don't have a kind of like verb of possession in Gaelic, you know, to have. Everything is much more kind of understood as a temporary, impermanent, very, very connected to the land. So that is a common thing it has with, many kind of indigenous languages throughout the world. Mm-hmm. So almost like I've always found in my experience, the more closely with a microscope you look at your own land underneath your feet, the closer you get to global stories very quickly. So that would be my aspiration, a kind of local globalism, and with folk having some investment, and by that I mean real power at the local level to affect some kind of change, because in terms of land issues we really are in a bit of a mess, and that connects very strongly to why I support independence, which is that I've always believed without independence we don't get nuclear disarmament. And coming from the west coast of Scotland, with the Hunterston Power Station, with a leukemia cluster in my own hometown, with my understanding of the connection between nuclear power and nuclear arms and the effect it has on women and children. I mean, it's essentially state terrorism. And so that's been almost one of my core values in life, really. And I'm an active member of Scottish CND and the Trident Ploughshares group, Rise Up Singing. So I try and bear witness to what I believe can be a kind of like role for Scotland in contributing to what we actually mean by peace. And I'd very much hope that the contribution of the women in the peace movement in Scotland can, in an independent Scotland, be readily recognised and play a role in the formation of policy and how we connect with the world. I'm happy to sit at the United Nations, you know, with my CND badge on.
Yeah, because from the way you're describing it, you're seeing Scotland very much as independence, very much as a chance for the nation to see itself again in new eyes, but also as a chance to be an example, to be a leader. In, you know, saying the world can look at us, setting us this example of being a nuclear-free Scotland, or a department for, women and disarmament. with this kind of role. Just one little thing on the linguistic thing. There's the Gaelic tradition, but there's an upcoming podcast that should be here in a couple of weeks, actually, with Scots. I'm speaking to someone from the campaign about promoting the Scots language. And where do you think that fits into the picture? Like, I've mentioned on the podcast a few times before that, even from my generation and certainly before, people speaking Scots were even in school, or certainly never used to be on the television.